Greetings, everyone. Aloha and welcome to the Center for Chinese Studies webinar series at UH Maloa. My name is Winston Wang. I'm a moderator and organizer of this series, and I teach Minqin China in the History Department. Today's roundtable discussion is about the relationship between China and India, the two great rising powers that account for over 1/3 of the world population. This relationship has its ups and downs, to be sure. Now, unfortunately, it seems to be at its lowest point in decades. The reasons are very complicated, the most important of which is a series of border clashes since 2013 in the Himalayas, the longest disputed border on the planet now. How to make sense of this complicated relationship and its regional and global implications? We are delighted to have three experts on South Asia and East Asia from different disciplinary backgrounds and with us today. Each of them will address those questions by focusing on one of the three perspectives: India, China, and the third party, Nepal, as the regional labor of both countries. So we can get a sense of how India-China relations are viewed through the eyes of the regional players themselves. Before introducing our three speakers, on behalf of the CCS, I would like to thank you all, especially our guests and the panelists, for joining us. I would also like to take this opportunity to introduce the hardworking team of CCS staff members led by the current director, Professor Min Baoyu, Associate Director, Dr. Cindy Ning, and the Program Coordinator, Ms. Jianing Sun. During this session, if you have any questions about technical or logistical issues, please use the chat forum that will be monitored and answered by Dr. Lin and Ms. Sun. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Department of History and International Studies at the Hawaiian Pacific University, as well as the Department of Asian Studies and the Center for South Asian Studies at UH Maloa. This roundtable discussion is also sponsored by the Office of Global Engagement at UH as one of the featured events for this year's Maloa International Education Week. We would like to thank and acknowledge all our co-sponsors for their support. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce our three speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Andrea Mauji. She is Assistant Professor of Political Science, International Studies, and Diplomacy and Military Studies at Hawaiian Pacific University. Her research interests are broadly South Asia, including political violence, nationalism, gender, and religion. She has published articles in the Journal of Terrorism and Political Violence, Progress in Development Studies, Studies in Ethnicity and Nationalism, and Political Science Education, and has a forthcoming book with Cambridge University Press. In 2021, she was selected as a Fulbright scholar to conduct research in India and was named HPU's Teacher of the Year. The second speaker is Dr. Yongjae Kim. He is Assistant Professor of Political Science and International Studies at Hawaii Pacific University. His research and teaching interests are East Asian politics, national security, and research methods. He has published articles in the Asian Survey and the Government and Opposition. Our third speaker is Dr. Anna Sturr. She is Associate Professor of Asian Studies and the Director of the Center for South Asian Studies at UH Maloa. Her book titled Singing Across Divides, Music and Intimate Politics in Nepal won the 2019 Bernard S. Cohen Prize for first books on South Asia from the Association for Asian Studies. The documentary film she co-directed, Seeing a Great Dream, has won multiple awards for its portrayal of a leading singer, songwriter of Leopold's militant left. Her research and teaching interests include expressive culture, politics, religion in South Asia, and especially in the Himalaya region. In terms of format, the three panelists will each speak for about 15 minutes. Then they will raise questions to each other and engage in a 15-minute conversation before we open up to our audience for Q&A. At any time during the presentation and the discussions, we invite our audience to use the Q&A forum instead of the chat function to send comments or questions, which we will monitor and present to our speakers after their presentation. Please do not wait to send your questions until the very end, because then we might run out of time to answer them. We'll try to take the questions in the order they have been submitted, but sometimes we have to synthesize or group them together due to the limitation of time. After today's presentation, we will send out a brief survey to our audience, and we would greatly appreciate if you could take a minute or two to give us some feedback. So without further ado, let me turn over to Dr. Andrea Moji.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and pull up my screen here for everybody. Thank you once again for hosting this, and I really appreciate UH and the Center for Chinese Studies for helping put together this really important panel from diverse perspectives, and I look forward to engaging with everyone, including the co-panelists here. So on that note, I'm going to go ahead and start. So as the title suggests, we're looking in today to understand the relations between China and India, and not so much if it's a source of rising concern, but in what ways it is a source of rising concern. So here you can see an image that gives an overview of where these disputed boundaries and borders and territories are. So to give a little background, as was already done in the introduction, here we can see that there is a long disputed border, and this has been disputed specifically since the war in 1962. And so there's a 2,200-mile disputed border between India and China, and it is the world's largest disputed border. And when we look here at the map, we can see that there are three key areas of dispute that we'll discuss today. Specifically, we have Kashmir and the border at Kashmir, which is a heavily disputed area, not just between India and China, but also India and Pakistan since the partition in 1947, where we see the boundaries over here between Kashmir administered by Pakistan and Kashmir administered by India. And so the disputed territory is over here on the northeast side, known as Aksai Chin, between India and China and along the border. The second area of contention is over here at sort of this junction where there is the Bhutan border and the Indian state of Sikkim. And so as we'll discuss today, there's been several direct clashes at this location, and it's a source of concern here. And then third is the area India refers to as Arunachal Pradesh and China refers to as South Tibet. And so it's not just that it's a disputed border, but again, this is also a disputed territory, with China believing that this is not a part of India that India refers to as Arunachal Pradesh, but instead it is southern Tibet. So to give more in-depth background, China has borders with 14 countries, but the unresolved borders are specifically with India and the small country of Bhutan. And so the dispute escalated to the highest in the 1962 war. But since then, it has been a relative peace with a couple of exceptions. So the one being in 1967, at Natula and Chola, which you can see here again at that junction between the Bhutan, China, India border. The 1967 conflict was considered a decisive victory for India, whereas the 1962 war was considered more of a decisive victory for China. India lost major territory in that 1962 war. After that, the next clash occurs in 1975, and that's in the Arunachal Pradesh, southern Tibet area, known as Tulungla. And until this point in time, until 2020, this was the last deadly confrontation or clash between India and China. And then there was Doklam in 2017, which was sort of the first indicator that we're seeing rising tensions between India and China after a relative peace since 1975. And so Doklam happened, Doklam is in the Sikkim area as well over here. And that was the first sort of direct clash since 1975. And during that point in time, leading up to Doklam, there had been increased border standoffs, aggressively patrolling tactics, and military construction projects along and near the contested territories. And so there starts being a real escalation in tensions really from kind of 2015 onward with those troop movements and buildings. And then the most concerning confrontation is one that happened within the past year in Galwan Valley, Ladakh, which is in Kashmir. And so that's when the border peace, relative peace, and that no one had been killed, ended with the deadly clash in Galwan Valley in Ladakh. And this was a particularly brutal type of conflict because of the location and the methods that were used in it. So at least 20 Indian soldiers died, and they were engaged in sort of a direct hand-to-hand combat using things like clubs and rocks. And on the next slide, I'll show you just what that terrain looks like and why it's so unforgiving. And since that happened, there's been increased border mobilizations, not just at Aksai Chin in Kashmir, but across all of those disputed borders. And that's a really key part of the rising concerns that we have. So when we look at where the 2020 conflict happened, you can see that this is probably the highest altitude conflict that we've experienced between two countries, because it occurred at 21,000 feet. So most people are using breathing apparatus, it's sub-zero temperatures. So you can imagine the type of engagement that's happening between the two sides, that they're, pelting each other with stones and clubs. And so this is, it's a harsh terrain. You can see the line here of where India and Pakistan, or India and China are, and they were essentially, both sides were fighting right along this border area right here. So the concerning thing is, since the 2020 confrontation, although there has been some cessation, at least fortunately no direct conflict since then, we see other things that are concerning that might lead to future conflict. So first of all, is just really recently, there's the October 2021, so just last month, China passed the land borders law. And this is in addition to a previous law that it was expanding sort of its maritime territories and the way that it's planning to patrol the maritime boundaries. So this is the land borders is focused on guarding land borders, and we know where those land border disputes are primarily with India and Bhutan. And so within the land borders law, there's a focus on not just defending the sovereignty and land border security of those borders, but also promoting development of things like infrastructure, civilian movement, military-civilian relations. So that might mean things like increased building of villages, movement of people to settlements along the border, things like that. And then additionally, right after the conflict we saw, or the clashes between India and China, we saw the deployment of an Indian warship to the South China Sea, kind of expanding where this area of confrontation could potentially happen, not just at India's land borders, but also in the maritime borders. So we're speaking first about these direct confrontations that are happening at the land borders. But it's important to take a broader regional context to understand how India is formulating how it sees this regionally and even globally. So historically, India has kind of been seen as the leader of South Asia. It's the largest country. Most of the bordering countries have, historical, cultural ties to India, but India is increasingly isolated within its neighborhood. As India's neighbors have become increasingly moving toward or developing economic and political relationships with China. And so China has invested really heavily with most of India's neighbors, particularly through these infrastructure development projects. And so probably of the most concern for India is the increasing close relationship between Pakistan and China. Because we already know that in Kashmir, the disputed territory is between, there's already a long history there with India and Pakistan. But if there is a new confrontation amid really further deteriorating relations between India and Pakistan, especially since 2019, in what manner will China have influence on that relationship? So India is very concerned about what this interaction may look like within Kashmir. And then, of course, broader context is just China has been investing throughout not just South Asia, but around the Pacific and even beyond as part of its Belt Road Initiative that's creating these ties to other countries. So India is well aware of what those burgeoning relationships mean for its relationships with its neighbors. And so recently, India has put a lot of concern about some of the structures that China is allegedly building along the disputed borders. So right after the conflicts, the clashes in 2020, there's reports of a 100-home village that was built in the disputed territory of Arunachal Pradesh, or as China refers to it, Southern Tibet. And in addition to that, there's also more villages that were allegedly built at that very strategic, historically conflictual tri-junction of India, Bhutan, and Nepal. And some analysts, Indian analysts, say that it's within Bhutan's territory. And so when discussing this sort of increased presence, you see some parallels to maybe China's strategy within the South China Sea, for example, building our artificial islands within South China Sea to sort of expand, historical and territorial maritime claims. And so Indian analysts are fearful that this is a strategy that's being used within the land and region of South Asia as well. And so in response to these reports, India has said it's not going to accept illegal occupation, sort of indicating its resolve toward China. So just to give a really brief overview of what some of those projects are that India is concerned about, we can see sort of throughout all of India's neighbors. So again, most concerning to India is the increasing relationship with Pakistan. So the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is one example. There's been 62 billion in loans for different infrastructure and energy projects. And strategically, a recent building of a major port in the Arabian Sea. So that's sort of expanding China's potential maritime presence within the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea, which is to expand upon another really strategic port that has India concerned, which is the Hambantota port, which is in eastern Sri Lanka, just south of India. Critics have called this debt trap diplomacy because these less developed countries take out loans to help with infrastructure projects. And so specifically in Sri Lanka, that's been the Hambantota port, which China now has a 99-year lease, and then thus access to this really strategic port in the Indian Ocean. In addition to the recent Chinese firm won access to a development of an energy project in the Palk Strait, which if you're familiar with that geography, that's sort of the narrow corridor that separates India and Sri Lanka. And then of course, Nepal, there's a recent project about the Trans-Himalayan corridor, which connects Lhasa with Kathmandu. Bangladesh, also China is the largest investor in Bangladesh. Again, this is in, India's eastern border. Historically, India and China had improved relations since the 1970 War of Independence for Bangladesh. And so there's a lot of rail and infrastructure projects within the region, although some of them have been put on hold due to financial issues with Bangladesh. And then in Myanmar, again, which shares a border with India as well, there's long been a Chinese presence in partnership with the government of Myanmar. But Myanmar recently experienced a coup in February 2021, where the junta returned to power within Myanmar. And since then, we've seen actually 21 new development projects in coordination with the junta in Myanmar. And then Maldives, which is an island group to the west of Sri Lanka, also has leased certain islands to China for 50 years. It's changed some of its laws to allow Chinese entities to acquire land without some of the competitive bidding that others have. And that's well below market rates. And so China accounts for about 53% of Maldives' external debt. So all of these things together represent why India is concerned. Again, the close relationship, increasingly close relationship with Pakistan is one that is particularly concerning to India. Different Indian leaders have said that the 2020 clashes left the relationship between the two profoundly disturbed. Another thing to take into consideration is that there is a strong increasing anti-China sentiment within India, and that is part as well of the growing Hindu nationalist movement, which is in power in India right now, and that shapes and influences the foreign policy of India. So India has done different things like banning Chinese websites like TikTok and WeChat, and wants to decrease its trade relations with China. The bigger concern is that, especially in Kashmir, you have 3 nuclear powers. And if there is a confrontation between these 3 countries, there's a historical willingness, at least in the past, of Pakistan potentially has suggested a willingness in 1999 to utilize nuclear weapons. And so we have to be very careful in how we proceed and think and analyze about what confrontation means in this very contested region. And then, of course, just broadly, given the new rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan and Pakistan's close relationship with the Taliban and China's partnership with Pakistan, which is very concerned about the movement of potential militants from Pakistan into China and vice versa, particularly from Xinjiang. Those are areas that China's really thinking about as well when it thinks about its relationship with Pakistan. And India is thinking about all of those as well. So that's all that I have for today. So thank you so much. And I look forward to speaking more about this.
Professor Wang, can I start now?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for having me today. So this topic is really great, particularly nowadays. Actually, 2 great powers in Asia, China and India. They have great, rivalry relationship, and also not only in Asia, but also, all of the international community really concerned about this critical issue. So let's talk about China-India relations. Particularly, today I have to explain some Chinese perspective on this issue. So briefly, I can introduce some related history of this issue, the border dispute between China and India. As you know, in 1949, after the Civil War of China, People's Republic of China finally established in 1949. Then China also merged Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, and also in 1959, China annexed the Tibetan area, right? So then China also tried to expand their territory from east to west, and then since the 1959, there are several different disputes or conflict between China and India. Particularly in 1962, the war happened between two great powers. The Sino-India War in 1962, particularly in Doklam area. And then just this Doklam area is really, really important in geopolitical issues and military strategy. And then there are several different disputes or conflict happened again and again. And then, but those since 1967, there are no real critical or huge conflict, even though there are some different minor issues and conflict. But nowadays, as you know, since 2017, Doklam area also a really critical area between two countries, and then military standoff also happened, and recently 2020 real clash between two countries in the Galwan Valley in Ladakh. Actually, Professor Malji explained this area, right? So yeah, this is a very brief history of disputable border between two countries. So, and also Professor Malji also explained, disputable area, like generally speaking, there are three different major disputable area. The first one is around, sorry about that, Exai Chin area, like very close to Kashmir area. Professor Malji also talk about that. And also another area is Arunachal Pradesh, this area very close to Bhutan. And the last real critical point, the area is Doklam. Doklam is just right here, just between Bhutan territory and this very small part of Indian area. This very almost at the end of this this area. So Doklam area is really, really important because experts, they say this area is chicken neck. So like chicken, like it's a chicken head and like chicken body, and this area just kind of very bottleneck, but they say chicken neck. So if China really control this chicken neck area, militarily and geopolitically, they have great advantage, right, against India and other small countries in South Asia, like including Nepal and Bhutan and Bangladesh. So therefore, they want to occupy this area, and possibly they want to expand their territory to Bangladesh. They entirely control this chicken neck. So therefore, why China really interested in Doklam area. And overall, why nowadays China have the real conflict with India particularly? Broadly speaking, just we need to understand Chinese politics and Chinese international strategy. Since actually in 2012, President Xi Jinping, he was new president in 2012, and he proclaimed that we can revive Chinese dream, right? The Chinese dream is we can make great history again, like our ancestors' history, like Han Dynasty or Tang Dynasty, right? Like a Silk Road. We can, just have new Silk Road and Maritime Road, right? We make a great history again. That is Chinese dream. This kind of real slogan of Xi Jinping era, we say that. And then also specifically, Xi Jinping government really propose or make great plan, grand international plan, we say the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013. That is the broad strategy of China to control international community or manage international community. particularly you can see that this map just in relation to India, these are red line, basically New Silk Road, right? This blue line is new maritime road. Around India, basically China want to make a new road with Pakistan and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Therefore, geopolitically and military strategy, they want to control the highest mountain area in the world, right? So if they have great advantage in that area, they can press India, and they have great more military strategy against India and generally control South Asian area, right? So you can see basically that is kind of their simple strategy. The first one is contain geopolitical and economic rival. Definitely India and China, they are rivals each other. Therefore, the China want to contain India. At the same time, they want to connect Pakistan, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. So their simple strategy is containment and connections. If they succeed in this strategy, they will entirely control Asian area, and then they can achieve their goal, Chinese dream. However, that is not really a very idealistic strategy or a very peaceful strategy, because nowadays, India and other countries also respond to these new Chinese strategy. For example, quadrilateral security dialogue, we just simply say, we say Quad. Quad is new grand strategy against China, including United States, Japan, India, and Australia. So basically China has new grand strategy, Belt and Road Initiative. On the other hand, United States and other great power countries, including Japan, India, and Australia, they have their own new strategy against China to keep balance between China and India. So basically, the first strategy, the first goal of Chinese dream is that China wants to be a greatest country in Asia. Then they believe we can entirely manage and make a new systematic world. Generally, we can, the Chinese believe we can control the entire world, right? So therefore, the first step is we have to make great advantage against other rivalry, particularly against India, right, in South Asian area. So even though this strategy is not successful, however, they want to have some more strategic card or strategic ways to have some advantage in their negotiation with India or even the United States. That is their general approach or strategy. However, China also has their own domestic issues. For example, nowadays, the President Xi Jinping, he wants to be a long-term president, not only 10 years or maybe 15 or 20 years. But if the President Xi Jinping wants to be a long-term president, he has to stabilize domestic politics, and he has to solve the domestic issues. But nowadays, Chinese people face new domestic issues, critical domestic issues like economic inequality and regional inequality. Nowadays, these economic and regional inequality in China is really, really serious. So could be one of the most serious economic inequality countries in the world nowadays. And also other their domestic issues like in relation to Xinjiang issue, Tibet issue and even Hong Kong issue, and also nowadays Taiwanese issue. So basically, if China really achieve their own goal based on Belt and Road Initiative, they have to stabilize their domestic politics and they have to solve their own domestic issues. However, I'm not sure. Does Chinese government, CCP government really manage and really solve these problems? If they have real domestic issues and they cannot solve these problems, just Belt and Road Initiative and other specific strategy is very it's not really consistent strategy and it's not really effective. So that's all my presentation today. So if you have any questions, let me know and we can talk about other issues further. Thank you.
Let's turn to Dr. Stir, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Wang, and thank you very much to those who went before me for providing so much good context. I'm going to speak today about Nepal and its efforts in striking a balance between India and China. And I think that because many listeners may be very familiar with both India and China, but less so with Nepal, I am going to give a sort of deep historical dive. In May 2020, China and India together inaugurated a road over Lipu Lek Pass, a historic route used in centuries of trans-Himalayan trade and Hindu and Buddhist pilgrimages to the sacred Mount Kailash. Nepal called foul. According to its treaty with the British East India Company in 1816, Lipu Lek was the point of Nepal-India-China tri-junction, and thus Nepal too had claim to Lipu Lek Pass. Yet it had not been consulted in building this road. Tensions escalated and anti-Indian protests within Nepal became a daily occurrence. India refused to negotiate, and China called it a bilateral issue between India and Nepal. Then, and a couple of weeks later, the two larger powers became embroiled in their own conflicts at the Galwan Valley, slightly to the west, in which 20 soldiers died, as Professor Malji has already mentioned. This Galwan Valley incident really worried Nepal, as is apparent from its official press releases at the time, asking China and India to resolve their dispute through, and I quote, peaceful means in favor of bilateral, regional, and world peace and stability. That's from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Nepal sees India and China's competition for influence in South Asia and the Himalayas as a source of security concern, and views the two powers as geopolitical competitors, as major economic powers, and as distinct civilizational entities requiring different types of engagement. And it also has its own issues with each of its neighbors. So throughout modern history, Nepal has conducted this balancing act between the powers to its north and south, and it continues to do so to this day. So back to Lipu Lek. In the ensuing months, Nepal's then Prime Minister, KP Oli, proposed a constitutional amendment changing the map of Nepal to incorporate even more territory over to the next pass west across the Himalayas, known as Limpiadura. Perhaps Oli had hoped that the greater claim would bring India to the negotiating table and help Nepal get the territory that it had a strong claim to, but India did not. Further, India accused China of being behind this change in Nepal's map. This was not actually the case. The causes lying more with the history of India-Nepal relations and Nepal's internal politics, plus the strong basis for Nepal's claim on Kalapani and access to Lipu Lek, though not Limpiadura. The amendment process went through and the constitutional amendment passed. According to this amendment, Nepal should now control a roughly 350 square kilometer parcel of land in this remote area of the Himalayas. But India continues to control this area while China stands back and watches. So what is so important about Lipu Lek and its surroundings, and how did we get here? A brief foray through modern Nepal's history of regional interactions can help us understand where it stands now as a nation with its own aspirations in relation to India and China. First, a word about the Himalayas as a regional economy and hub for trade and cultural exchange. At one point, this is how they were seen, with passes and high pastures as routes and economic boons for what one ethnographer of Tibetan transhumance has referred to as fields on the hoof. Trans-Himalayan ties are rooted in patterns of trade, especially that of salt and wool. The Tibetan word for Nepal, Belyu, actually means place of wool. They're also rooted in local livelihoods based on transhumance and Tibetan and Chinese desire for Buddhist texts from India and Nepal. In the 7th century, the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo opened up ties with China and Nepal through marriage alliances. The wives, Princess Wencheng and Princess Brikuti, helped bring Buddhism to Tibet and open up more direct trade routes between China and Nepal, that's going through Tibet, and also linking Nepal, China, and India to a greater degree. Tibetans and Chinese went to study in Nepali and Indian Buddhist centers. And when Buddhism declined in India, the flow of interested scholars went the other direction to the now flourishing Buddhist monasteries on the Tibetan side. Communities in Nepal-Tibet border areas had and have shifting alliances.
I didn't get that. Could you try it?
Sorry, Siri's talking to me. So the account that I give now focuses on the Nepali Gorkhali state, which had times of greater and lesser control in its remote reaches. Traditionally, sovereignty in border areas has been a blurry concept, and border area locals continue to benefit from this fact. But the borders have been hardening since the 19th century. Okay, so in 1769, Prithvinarayan Shah of the small state of Gorkha conquered the Kathmandu Valley and started his campaign of conquering, moving outwards. In the ensuing years, this would lead to his forces brushing up against both the Qing Empire and the British East India Company, leading credence to his often cited declaration that the country now known as Nepal was a yam between two boulders. Nepal's history as a Himalayan state since the 18th century has been marked by constant negotiations and shifting alliances with the powers to the north and south. This map here shows the white part is Nepal today. The shaded gray part is what Prithvinarayan Shah and his armies was able to conquer. And the shaded striped part is what they were trying to do when they brushed up against the British East India Company and got into a big war. But previous to that, they did have wars with Tibet. Now, the first one in 1788 was a war with Tibet, not with China, and it was concluded with the Treaty of Kirong. But the tensions did not cease. So in 1792, there was another war, and in this time, Tibet called upon the assistance of the Qing. The Qing armies came all the way down south to Betrawati, which is this dot Nuakot is close by. So it's about here where the Qing armies came down. And they signed the Treaty of Betrawati, which made both Tibet and Nepal officially tributaries of the Qing. So as far as I have been able to find, Nepal paid tributes to the Qing until 1865. And if the Qing historian here can correct me on that, then I'd be grateful, because this is something that I've been looking for and not finding conclusive evidence to. But 1865 is the last date that I find. So in addition to expanding into Tibet, now we see this come to the stripy part. The Gorkhali armies expanded westward, conquering Kumaon in what is now Uttarakhand in India, so over here, the gray part. When they tried to expand to the south to take Awadh and the prized city of Lucknow, the British East India Company decided to stop them. When Nepal went to the Qing Amban in Lhasa for assistance, the Amban refused to help. So the Gorkha forces had to fight the British on their own. The Anglo-Gorkha War from 1814 to 1816 also ended in a stalemate, with both sides claiming victory, but the East India Company coming out on top with a treaty that had Nepal give up 1/3 of its territory. So now the white part is what's been left of Nepal since then. This treaty, the Treaty of Sugauli, delineated Nepal's border as a small tributary of the Kali River that placed the Nepal East India Company Tibet tri-junction at Lipulekh, which we'll come back to later. It also started Gorkhali soldiers' recruitment into the East India Company forces, what's now known as Gurkha recruitment, and continues today. Throughout the 19th century, Nepal continued to pay tributes to the Qing, but watched the East India Company attain military victories all over the subcontinent and against China in the Opium Wars. By 1855, Nepal took advantage of Qing decline to try another expansion into Tibet, but was thwarted this time by the Tibetans. But in 1904, when the British decided to send an expedition to Tibet, Nepal readily offered them support. Thus, Nepal switched alliances slowly and strategically throughout the 19th century, and by aligning with British India, put itself in a position to resist Qing claims of suzerainty, should any have occurred after 1904. But it happened that the Qing and its successors were far more interested in Tibet than in controlling territory on the other side of the Himalayas. As geopolitics shifted and nationalisms grew and colonial powers declined in the first decades of the 20th century, Britain recognized Nepal as a sovereign state in 1929 rather than a protectorate, which it had been calling it, which Nepal didn't appreciate. Nepali soldiers continued to fight for Britain in the First and Second World Wars, and subsequently, at the end of World War II, when the formerly colonized nations of the subcontinent gained their independence, India offered Nepal the return of the territory that it had ceded to the British in the Treaty of Sigauli. Nepal's rulers, the autocratic Rana family, were afraid of the democratic currents riding high in India and declined. This has been a bone of contention with Nepali nationalists since then, with demands to restore Nepal's so-called lost territory becoming an increasing part of anti-India political rhetoric. In 1950, a pro-democracy uprising happened in Nepal anyway, and with India's help, the Ranas were deposed, the Shah monarchy restored to full power, and movements toward democracy were attempted throughout the 1950s until a new king curtailed them in 1960. The treaty signed between Nepal and newly independent India at this time did not supersede the Treaty of Sigauli, but set out the terms of relationship between the two new nation states. What I wanted to show with this history of regional interactions was how Nepal made choices from its position as the proverbial yam between two boulders, even as the nature of the boulders changed. Now I want to turn to the present day and some current political issues and points of contention between Nepal and India and Nepal and China. In the past 10 years, it's clear that Nepal has been moving closer to China, but it retains a close relationship with India as well, despite disputes. I'm going to outline these points of contention from the perspective of ordinary Nepalis, and I'm representing my own ethnographic and historical observations rather than any official positions here. Nepal and India share a dominant Hindu culture, and many of their languages are closely related. The 1950 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between Nepal and India asserts that the two countries have a special intimate relationship, and in practice has afforded India control of Nepal's imports, especially petroleum products. When India has perceived Nepal as moving closer to China or otherwise acting in anti-India ways, India has responded with what Nepal sees as unofficial and undeclared economic blockades. The first of these was in 1962, when Nepal's King Mahendra was negotiating a border agreement with China and was considering signing a non-aggression pact as well. The Sino-Indian War of the same year brought an end to this blockade. The second blockade was in 1989, when amid rising internal unrest and fear of India's military adventurism in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, Nepal decided to purchase arms from China. Selling these arms to Nepal led China's relations with India to deteriorate once again. The third blockade was in 2015, spurred by India's refusal to support Nepal's newly promulgated constitution. When Nepali protesters attacked Indian trucks at the border, India responded by unofficially ceasing to export petrol to Nepal. Some scholars have argued that Nepal has actually benefited greatly from the terms of the 1950 treaty, but nevertheless, the general attitude among the Nepali public that has experienced these blockades is that the treaty gives India an unfair amount of control over Nepal. Another fact-based perception is that India often overreaches itself diplomatically or interferes too much in Nepal's internal affairs. For just a few recent examples, the 2006 ceasefire agreement that ended Nepal's Maoist People's War and brought the Maoist Party into parliamentary politics was brokered in Delhi. India's close involvement in Nepal's subsequent political processes, up until the most recent regime change from Oli to Doba as PM of a new coalition government, is also quite well documented. All of these reasons and more have fueled anti-India rhetoric as part and parcel of Nepali politicking. and contribute to creating a favorable public sentiment toward a turn to China. China's economic rise has also led Nepal to seek greater economic cooperation. Unlike Nepal and India, Nepal and China share far fewer cultural and linguistic ties. The cultural and linguistic similarities across the Himalayas are with Tibet rather than with Beijing. And in comparison with India, Nepal views China, that is Beijing, as more culturally distant. Nepal's biggest issue with China has been that of Tibetan refugees. In the 1960s, Nepal allowed the CIA, you probably all know this history, to set up a base on its northern border where US trained Tibetans, they were trained in Colorado, harassed and attacked Chinese patrols running over the border. This provoked China into mistrusting Nepal, but a great deal of that mistrust has been mended over the ensuing decades. Nepal has taken an increasingly intolerant policy towards Tibetan refugees doing anything considered anti-China within Nepal. In 2005, they closed the Tibetan Welfare Office, and since 2008 protests against the Beijing Olympics, they have kept a very, very close watch on Tibetan refugees' public expression of any kind. The people who lose out in this case, of course, are the Tibetan refugees who remain in Nepal and remain stateless. This issue is currently a back burner one, but it remains an important one between Nepal and China. A second issue between Nepal and China is not so much a point of contention, but a set of ongoing negotiations about infrastructure projects. And this is a map from a very detailed article by friends of mine, Galen Merton and Austin Lord, who have studied in depth Nepal's participation in the BRI since it signed on in 2017. And everything that's circled in black, all the dots circled in black, are Chinese cooperation hydropower projects. So you can see that there's a lot of them, and China is quite involved in a lot of infrastructure projects in Nepal. The US is also a player in this power game, and its aid packages through the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, have come under political fire due to their perceived power to upset China and destabilize Nepal. So a lot of public sentiment in Nepal is against the MCC, although there is quite a bit of support for it as well, because a lot of people say, hey, it's foreign aid, it's money, let's take it. And then another issue that must concern China, but I haven't really heard China speak about, is that of Gurkha recruitment. So when the armies split at Indian independence, India did keep some of the brigades of Gurkhas. So now Nepali soldiers are recruited into the Indian army. So one can imagine that that could be an issue between China and India and Nepal regarding the security of the northern borders, especially since the Nepalis are often deployed on the northern borders. And the last thing is border disputes. So in September 2021, Nepali Congress politicians from Karnali, which is a border region, asserted that the Chinese were building within Nepali territory and moving border pillars in the remote area of Limi. This is an area that when the PRC first got founded, China was actually asking the people of that area if they wanted to join the PRC, because geographically it's on that side of the Himalayas, and it's been one of those blurry sovereignty areas. So a 2017 report also says that such pillar moving activity has occurred at other border sites as well. The ministry responsible for the report has now disavowed it, but anecdotal evidence suggests that it may have some truth to it. This recent turn to border issues with China also has roots in an internal political shift. The Nepali Congress Party, although they supported former PM Oli's Lipulekh claim, has traditionally been closer to India, and they see the communist parties since 2008 as the leaders in Nepal's turn to China. Pointing out anomalies in a friendly relationship with China is likely an internal power play. So, returning to Lipulekh, the border dispute at the India-Nepal-China tri-junction on Nepal's western border. Based on careful research with the colonial and Nepali records, retired British General Sir Sam Cowan asserts that Nepal's claim to Kalapani and access to Lipulekh is extremely strong, but its claim to Limpiadura over here is less so. As Cowan and others show, while the border was fixed in the Treaty of Sugali as coming down along the Kali River from Lipulekh, That's like basically going from here to here, from Lipulekh to Kalapani. Nepal contested this in 1817. The East India Company declined to relinquish its access to Lipulekh, and Nepal did not pursue the matter again for over a century. Having also sat out of multiple India-China bilateral border discussions that had the potential to affect its territory as well, Nepal finds itself at a disadvantage in negotiations. Plus, having passed a constitutional amendment claiming Limpiadura, Nepal now finds itself in a political bind, needing another 2/3 majority to change its claim if it should wish to do so. China's refusal to get involved suggests that it is not going to risk further confrontation with India over a matter that may seem of little consequence compared to its own recent border skirmishes. For Nepal, this small bit of territory has come to stand for Nepali sovereignty in popular cultural political discourse, and its symbolic importance is not going away. But Nepal has clearly turned to China as an important bilateral partner. With India-China tensions remaining high, and as border control becomes more of a reality in the remote high Himalayas, Nepal will have to keep up its balancing act. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stir, Dr. Mauji, and Dr. Kim for your very informative presentation. Before we open up to our audience for Q&A, do you have any questions for each other? We can have about 10-minute discussion.
I have a question for Dr. Stir. If I wanted to see, first of all, thank you so much, because I feel like this is just such an ignored component of this discussion, and yet Nepal is literally right in the middle. So I'm glad to have that perspective. So you talked about the rise of the Communist Party after the fall of the monarchy within Nepal, and I wanted to see if you could sort of speak more about if you feel that that was kind of a key transition point for Nepali politics, was with the end of the monarchy and the election of the Communist Party. I think I'm getting that correct. And how that, if that created an important shift. The second comment on that is, speaking of cultural ties, I know that this past year, I believe the Prime Minister of Nepal actually said that the god Rama, who's a very important god in Hinduism, was actually born in Nepal instead of India. And I just thought that was indicative of this sort of the shift in discourse.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so as to the first one, it's important to note that China did not support Nepal's Maoist movement. It's also important to note that there are at least 25 communist parties in Nepal. So what we're talking about here is the Maoist party that fought the People's War's success in the 2008 elections in not gaining a 2/3 majority, but gaining the majority needed to run a coalition, which lasted not very long. So what happened then is that other political analysts in China who had kind of been marginalized because they were saying, well, maybe Nepal is doing something interesting, maybe we should support these Maoists. They then kind of came back onto the scene, and Nepal-China relations were, or at least relations between China and the Maoists, developed through unofficial channels in conversation between Maoist politicians and these particular analysts who saw something in them that they perceived as useful for negotiation. And that led the Maoist politicians to then be able to establish ties with China. And those ties did continue to grow. They didn't really turn back once Prachanda's government ended due to internal disputes in 2009. And even in 2012, the first CA government ended without a constitution in Nepal, but that coincides with Xi Jinping's rise to power. And Xi Jinping wanted to maintain closer relations with Nepal. So it's partially there is partially a change with the communist parties. The Nepali Congress Party definitely is spinning it that way in Nepal, but I think it's not just a communist friendship relation. I think it is just bilateral strategy and negotiations that are not necessarily guided by a common ideology. And so Oli is no longer prime minister, the guy who was making pronouncements. That particular pronouncement was largely ridiculed in the Nepali press, and it was seen, as you saw it, as kind of grandstanding. And yeah, he does things like that. He, like Modi and Trump, and perhaps as some people see it, she is an authoritarian. And he likes to do that kind of grandstanding. He's not in charge right now, though.
Thank you.
Great.
I
Any
have
more
one
questions?
question, yeah, for Professor Stir. So first of all, thank you for your great presentation, because I learned a lot about Nepal. So just, I don't have very great knowledge or information about Nepal, but after your presentation, I know a lot of things. But you mentioned that like Nepal and the United States, they work together in terms of Tibetan issues. For example, CIA, like secretly help, Tibetan, soldiers and Tibetan people attack, you know, border area in China. So what do you think about nowadays the relationship between Nepal and the United States?
Okay, yeah, the CIA in Tibet is a very, in terms of Nepali political history, it's many governments ago. So King Mahendra, who is no longer alive, and also there's no longer a monarchy, tolerated CIA presence, and it was not officially approved. And as political fortunes changed in Nepal, even King Mahendra decided that, oh, this had been a bad idea. So it's no, relations between Nepal and the United States are really colored by a regional lens, because while Nepal desires the goodwill and support of the United States, Nepal also has to be realistic in that the United States is not located next door. So the US is a major provider of foreign aid, and that is important. The current dispute regarding US involvement in Nepal is regarding the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is sort of foreign aid disguised as foreign direct investment. They want to make more hydropower projects. As far as I can tell, those are the Nepali side's proposals. And the interesting thing here is that Nepal is now an energy surplus country since the 2021 full operation of the Upper Burigandaki hydropower project. So now it's like Nepal wants to be a hydropower energy exporting country. And so it's at the level of like business people. One objection is that MCC involvement is going to be crony capitalism, and Nepali people are not going to benefit from these new hydropower projects because it's going to be about selling power to India and rich capitalists getting all the benefits from it. There are other perceptions in Nepal, like that one is the clearest to me, but then there are rumors, and rumors just fly. So people on the ground are saying, if the US MCC comes and builds these hydropower projects, US soldiers may be stationed there, and this US military presence will be greatly disruptive in Nepal and with India-China relations as well. So these are rumors, but I think it's important to pay attention to popular perception as well as looking at official negotiations. So those are there as well. So it's a very contentious issue at the moment, but it's just one issue, and it's not the entire relationship between Nepal and the US. there's much that the US has done for Nepal that Nepal still wants to continue and greatly appreciates.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions before we open up?
I guess I have a question for Professor Kim. It was really interesting what you were discussing about China's desire to have greater control over the chicken's neck and not just Arunachal. So could you expand upon that a little bit?
Basically, geopolitically, just that area is really important in terms of controlling, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and even possibly, Nepal, because chicken neck is really, connected with other several countries. So China really want to have some more strategic advantage on that area. However, India, really know Chinese strategy in the chicken's neck. So there is really strong conflict between China and India, and also Bangladesh. This country also really kind of the country that make more great negotiation with India and China. So in terms of Chinese perspective, Bangladesh also really great partner in South Asia. So kind of they want to make more great deal with China, the Bangladesh perspective. So yeah, just chicken neck is really, really important in their military strategy and regional strategy in South Asia.
Thank you.
Can I add on to that? So this little area, the Siliguri corridor, yeah, like I forget, I think at one point it's only like 24 kilometers or something. But these 7 sister states in the Northeast India all have some history of separatism, and they often do not feel culturally, religiously, politically connected to mainland India. And so I think there's been insurgencies and different uprisings since the independence, and it's something to keep an eye on of how that has a broader geopolitical impact, especially as you see rising tensions between the two, is how might separatist movements in border regions like, Arunachal Pradesh and the other states there take advantage of this and potentially also want to shift away from India as they've historically wanted to do.
Great, thank you again. I'd like to ask all of you a very general question. Feel free to respond, any of you, if you find it interesting. This relationship between the two great powers, of course, is very complicated, and it is decided by so many different factors. I can think of 4 important ones. For example, the mutual perception of each other and their border dispute and their geopolitical alliances and the security partnership and their national power differences. Okay, I'd like to briefly comment on some of those factors. First, national power differences. China, right now, the economic size of China is 5 times larger than that of India. And the gap is growing. Given the increasing power difference between the two countries, China doesn't feel the need to contain India, or doesn't need a balancing partner against India, but India does, as it has done many times in its history. For instance, India often chooses a stronger partner like Soviet Union or United States to try to balance against China in the Cold War. So the dilemma is the power differences and the growing power differences pushes India to seek balancing partner against China. but China doesn't like it. And China don't find it necessary to balance against India because the power difference from the Chinese perspective is quite big. And the Chinese don't like the Indian alliances like Quad, which is targeting toward China. So this definitely adds to the distrust and the misunderstandings in the relationship. So how can we solve this big structural dilemma? And that's the first question I want to ask you. And the second one is about the mutual perception, okay? The most fundamental misperception between the two countries is their inability to comprehend each other's international ambitions. What is your role in international order? And what is your international ambitions? Can you talk a little bit about India's dominant view of China and its role in international world, and also talk about China's view of India and its international ambitions? I will stop here and maybe I jump back in after hearing your response.
That's a lot to think about, yeah.
I think Melody, you can go first.
Okay. Well, the first question was how to solve, and I don't know how to solve such a complex problem that can be answered within the next several minutes. But I do think that you're spot on with those observations that there is a big power differential, whether that's economic power, social power, military power. India does not have the same military capabilities. It has nuclear weaponry, but in terms of, especially like naval power, I don't think that there's even a match there. And in terms of just the type of internal challenges that India has with economic development, whether that's and social development, there's just still, although many people have come out of poverty and we've had increasing literacy rates, in comparison to China, it's still at a much worse pace. So India has a lot of these internal economic issues that it needs to resolve in addition to focusing on what it perceives as this large regional global threat. And I think you're right that there is a lack of understanding, particularly in India. I think that there is certainly skepticism, if not borderline demonization of Chinese goals, of what their goals might be. And that when we have misperceptions, that escalates the likelihood of conflict. And so particularly when there's that misperception, in addition to like the fog of war, then we have the likelihood, particularly in Kashmir, I think, of conflict, which is why I pointed my concerns there. I don't know if that's answering all points of your question, but that's just kind of giving some additional insight from what I view as India's perspective.
Thank you very much. Any other observations?
I can say something from a Nepal-centric standpoint. I'm not saying that I'm speaking from Nepal's perspective, but historically, you've got Prithvinarayan Shah in the latter half of the 18th century saying that his country, the Gorkhali state, is a yam between two boulders. Now, this is not just the Qing and the East India Company. He's looking back further to whatever is the reigning dynasty in China and the Mughal Empire, the Delhi Sultanate, whatever is a great uniting power to the south. So from a Nepal-centric standpoint, history kind of tells us that there's going to be a tension between great powers centered north and south of the Himalayas, and whatever shape that takes will be colored by the objective conditions of the time. But resolving it and making it dissolve completely is maybe not a realistic view. It's more like how do you balance?
So
Definitely our key
quickly,
terms in international relations is balancing powers. Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Kim.
a quick response for that question is also I don't know what is real solution between two great powers. So, but basically, in terms of Chinese perspective, Chinese government nowadays is really concerned about the rise of India. So, for example, the United States basically, over a long period, really concerned about the rise of China. Like that, Chinese government nowadays really concerned about the rise of India, because if India could be the greatest power in Asia, the Chinese government cannot achieve their goal, international perspective. So we have to take action against India at this time, because after 10 years or even, in near future, just India could be more stronger than possibly China. Therefore, we have to take action right now, possible the real rival. So yeah, basically, maybe two countries need mutual reconciliation, something like that, but how can they have the great relationship between two countries? So I have no idea, realistically.
That's an interesting perspective, which I want to complicate that. So as I said, the Chinese understanding of India is quite different from what you just described, or from Indian perspective. And the Chinese understanding of India is the relationship is a bigger power versus a lesser power. Okay, India is one of the biggest developing countries, but in terms of many different criteria, India is lagging far behind of China. I'm not just too arrogant or self-centered to see that, but you just look at the economy, the military technology, infrastructure building ability, so my point is this relationship is not a zero-sum game, because Chinese don't take Indian as the enemy. It is China's strategic interest to have good relationship with India so that China can have its, as Professor King said, 中国梦, Chinese dream, national rejuvenation on the world stage. If you have your enemy right at your door, how can you become a great power on the world stage? And the US is trying to contain China, and the Chinese diplomacy is focused on dealing with this Sino-American rivalry or competition. It is China's best interest to have good relationship with India, unless India doesn't interpret it in the right way and insist on two great power relationship based on a zero-sum game. That's the problem from the Chinese side to understand the relationship. We want to have economic tie with you. We want to have trade with you. Let's develop together, because Chinese dream is not about controlling India and containing India as you try to portray in your presentation, because this One Belt, One Road initiative is basic, massive infrastructure to jumpstart regional development and to address the big deficit in Asia and other parts of the world in building infrastructures. So it's not about neo-imperialism of taking over the market or taking over the resources. It's all based on mutual negotiation or a win-win negotiation. So I think this is the Chinese intention. Well, whether regional labor, how regional labor interpret this intention, that's another story. But we need to understand their strategic intention. I think there is a misunderstanding in this strategic intention. I think a key challenge for India is to figure out, do we want to change our long-term policy of non-alignment to preserve our strategic autonomy? Or should we ally closely with Western powers in this effort to contain China? if this is the case, the Chinese increasingly aggressive attitude toward India is the result, but it's never the intention of the Chinese, because again, it is Chinese best interest to have good relationship with India, because Chinese government never take India as a great threat.
Professor Wang, can I add on to that as well?
Yes, please.
Yeah, first I wanted to say that I didn't mean to suggest a zero-sum game when I said that Nepal is looking for balance in between the two great powers to its north and south. And I also wanted to add that in Nepal's understanding of China's intentions, China continues to express concern for sovereignty at as sort of a basic principle of its intention in international relations. So what Nepal has seen as a century nearly of India messing with its internal affairs, they welcome China's rhetoric of bolstering national sovereignty. So there's a difference in underlying perspectives and attitudes from Nepal towards India and China, because India represents itself in terms of control and more or less power within the region, whereas China represents itself in terms of making sure that these smaller states are retaining their sovereignty while providing infrastructural development initiatives. So this is again, it's a matter of representation. People who are closer to the political center of negotiations than I will be able to tell better what is going on behind the scenes.
Thank you very much. That's a very good observation. Thank you so much for your presentation and the lively discussion. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And a big mahalo to our three speakers again for joining us and for sharing with us your great expertise and your insights. And also many thanks to our audience for joining us and submitting some comments and questions which we don't have time to get to. And before you go, a quick reminder that we have another event coming up on December 1st, focusing on science collaborations between UH Maloa and the Chinese institutions. We hope you can join us again. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
So,
Thank you so much.